A tourist, sure his status gave him the right to mock tradition, dumped trash at a royal guardsman's feet. But when the guard finally reacted, his response shocked the crowd and left the tourist trembling. What happened next became an unforgettable lesson in respect.
But before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. We share the untold stories, secrets, and traditions of the British Guards every day. And trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next.
At the heart of London, near Buckingham Palace, stood a guardsman dressed in the iconic black tunic, its sharp lines pressed to perfection, and a tall bearskin hat that towered above the crowd. His name was Michael Hudson. At just 28 years old, his solemn brown eyes and fair complexion carried the weight of a centuries-old tradition. For Michael, this wasn't merely a job, it was a solemn duty, a chance to honor his country and the legacy of those who had stood in his place long before him. Every fiber of his being was committed to precision, discipline, and unshakable composure. The plaza buzzed with life, tourists swarming like bees in a hive, cameras flashing, and voices blending into a chaotic symphony of languages. Laughter and excitement punctuated the air as families and friends paused to marvel at the grandeur of Buckingham Palace, their eyes occasionally drifting toward the stoic figure of Michael, who seemed carved from stone. Among the cheerful chaos, one figure stood out. He wore a glaring green jacket that clashed vividly against the muted elegance of the surroundings. He was Jackson Miller, a middle-aged American with a ruddy face and a mischievous glint in his eyes. His reputation as a provocateur preceded him. He was the kind of man who thrived on stirring reactions, often crossing the line between humor and outright offense. In his hand was an oversized plastic bag, bulging with trash, as if he had planned his next move long before stepping foot onto British soil. With deliberate strides, Jackson walked up to Michael, his every movement brimming with exaggerated confidence. The crowd, caught between curiosity and unease, parted like a wave before him. Without hesitation, he tipped the bag over, spilling its contents, a vile mix of crumpled paper, empty bottles, and greasy wrappers, onto the polished cobblestones at Michael's feet. Gasps echoed through the crowd, shock rippling outward like a stone dropped into still water. Tourists froze mid-step, their faces twisted in disbelief. Phones emerged from pockets, recording this bizarre spectacle. Some exchanged horrified glances, whispering their outrage. Yet, amidst the uproar, Michael remained unmoving, his face a mask of composure. Only the tightening of his gloved hands behind his back betrayed the tempest brewing within. Jackson laughed loudly, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd like a jagged knife. His face was flushed with amusement as he positioned himself in front of the pile of garbage he had just dumped. With exaggerated gestures, he pulled out his phone and began snapping selfies, tilting his head for dramatic angles. The bright green of his jacket was like a beacon of mockery standing out against the elegant backdrop of Buckingham Palace. "Hey, Mr. Robot!" he bellowed, his voice laced with derision. "Are you even alive? Or are you just a dressed-up doll?" His words dripped with mockery, each syllable a calculated jab aimed at the guardsman's unyielding stoicism. Jackson's grin widened as he waved his arms, egging on the crowd. He was here for one thing, a reaction, something he could boast about later to his friends, who would no doubt laugh along at his antics. The mood of the crowd began to shift. The initial gasps of shock were replaced by a growing murmur of disapproval. Tourists who had been snapping photos of the palace now turned their phones toward Jackson, capturing his tasteless display. Some muttered angrily, while others openly shouted at him to stop. A woman near the front of the crowd called out, "Have some respect!" A father, holding his child's hand, shook his head in disgust. Yet Jackson seemed impervious to their condemnation, feeding off the attention like a moth drawn to a flame. And still, Michael stood motionless. His face was a mask of composure, the hallmark of his duty, but inside, every insult landed like a blow. The mocking laughter, the garbage at his feet. These were not just affronts to him personally, but to the centuries of tradition he was sworn to uphold. His heart pounded with a mix of anger and resolve, but his father's voice, calm and firm, echoed in his mind. Sometimes justice doesn't find its way naturally. You have to step up and deliver it. Michael inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with the cool London air. This moment was no longer about protocol. It was about defending something far greater than himself. Though he knew the risks, he also knew that some situations demanded action. And this, undeniably, was one of them. As Jackson bent down, reaching for another handful of trash, Michael broke his stoic stance. With a measured step forward, the sharp sound of his polished boots striking the cobblestones echoed through the square. The sudden movement caught everyone off guard. His foot landed squarely between Jackson and the pile of garbage, halting the man in his tracks. The crowd collectively held their breath, the murmurs dying out as dozens of eyes turned to the Guardsman. "You're disrespecting my country and its traditions," Michael said. His voice was calm, almost too calm, but underneath it was an unmistakable edge of steel. The words cut through the tense silence like a blade. Jackson froze, his outstretched hand hovering over the trash. For a moment he seemed utterly baffled. The Guardsman wasn't supposed to speak, let alone confront him. It went against every expectation he had, and every video he had ever seen online. Michael stood tall, his unflinching gaze locking onto Jackson's. His eyes, dark and piercing, carried a quiet authority that made the American shrink back involuntarily. "You want a show?" Michael asked, his tone sharp and unwavering, carrying across the square. "Allow me to show you the lesson of respect." He extended his arm, pointing at the heap of garbage with a deliberate motion. "Pick it up. Now." Jackson blinked, his bravado suddenly crumbling. The arrogant grin that had been plastered across his face moments ago disappeared, replaced by unease. He glanced nervously at the crowd, which had grown larger and louder. People were no longer passive observers. A chant began to ripple through the mass. "Apologize! Clean it up!" The words gained momentum, surging like a wave of collective disapproval. Jackson's face flushed a deep red. The weight of their anger bore down on him, palpable and inescapable. For the first time, he looked genuinely unsure of himself, his bravado faltering under the Guardsman's unwavering stance and the crowd's mounting hostility. Under the weight of the crowd's scrutiny and the unwavering presence of Michael, Jackson's arrogance finally crumbled. His once defiant posture gave way to reluctant submission as he dropped to his knees. The cobblestones beneath him felt cold and unforgiving, much like the judgmental stares of those around him. His hands trembled as he reached for the crumpled paper and plastic bottles scattered at the Guardsman's feet. Piece by piece, he shoved the garbage back into the oversized plastic bag. Each movement seemed heavier than the last, weighed down by the humiliation burning on his face. The crowd watched in silence, their disdain palpable. Some recorded the moment, their phones capturing every second of Jackson's humbling ordeal. Others exchanged quiet words of approval, nodding at the Guardsman's firm but composed stance. Jackson avoided their eyes, his head bowed low as if hoping to shrink into invisibility. The laughter and bravado that had once fueled him were now long gone, replaced by the crushing reality of public disgrace. As Jackson placed the final piece of trash into the bag, he looked up hesitantly, searching for some sign of leniency in Michael's face. But Michael remained as steady as a statue, his sharp gaze unyielding. After a moment of tense silence, Michael gave a small, measured nod. "Now you may leave," he said, his voice calm but firm, carrying an authority that brooked no argument. Without a word, Jackson stood, clutching the trash bag in his trembling hands. His shoulders hunched, he slinked away through the crowd, which parted wordlessly to let him pass. The murmurs of disdain followed him, soft whispers that cut deeper than any shouted insult. His bright green jacket, once an emblem of his attention-seeking antics, now seemed garish and out of place. The moment Jackson disappeared from sight, the square erupted in applause. The sound was thunderous, a resounding affirmation of the Guardsman's dignity and resolve. Michael returned to his post, standing tall and still as ever, his face betraying no emotion. Yet, within, he felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. Justice had been served, not with violence or rage, but with steadfastness and resolve. The story didn't end there. Within hours, videos of the incident flooded social media. Millions watched as Michael turned the tables on a bully with grace and restraint. Praise poured in from around the globe, lauding the Guardsman who stood firm in the face of blatant disrespect. As for Jackson, the lesson he learned that day would linger for a lifetime. Respect isn't optional. It's earned and, when necessary, demanded.
If you enjoyed this story, leave a like and let us know in the comments which guard tradition you'd like us to cover next. See you in the next video.